Shalom everybody from Israel. This is the VFI News. And anyone else watching this video, all I've got to tell you is Happy New Year. Well, 2025 ended and saved some of its biggest surprises for last. U.S. President Donald Trump hosted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida this past week for meetings that could be transformative for the entire Middle East. The president of Iran might have accidentally said out loud what many of us have known instinctively for a long time, that his country is at war with the United States, Israel, and Europe. But now it might be descending into civil war as massive street demonstrations are once again rocking the capital. And this time, the police don't seem to be trying very hard to defend the regime. Meanwhile, Hezbollah in Lebanon is not making any secret of the fact that it is rearming and preparing for another round of fighting with Israel in the not-so-distant future. And the Houthis in Yemen are quietly doing the same thing. Iran is also doing everything it can to build up the Shiite militias in Iraq for another showdown with Israel, while Jordan and the United States are hitting the Islamic State terror group in Syria with the apparent cooperation of the Al-Jolani regime. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Friends, that introduction might have sounded a bit grim, and I apologize for that, but the facts are impossible to ignore. Israel's enemies have not learned anything from the terrible pounding they received from the IDF over the past 2 years. The so-called Axis of Resistance, led by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has lost most of its trained and experienced leadership, vast stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, and thousands of trained fighters and operatives. In Iran itself, the population is suffering under the weight of an economy in tatters, a currency that is functionally useless, drought, and some of the worst air quality on earth, making life miserable if not impossible in major cities. The Iranian economy is bust now, and the rial, the currency of Iran, is 1.4 million rial to the US dollar. These ordinary Iranian citizens have got little or nothing left to lose, as they've decided to rise up against their oppressors once more. Now, a note of caution is in order before we get our hopes up, because we've seen this movie several times over the past several years, for instance in 2017 and 2022. Each time there were mass protests. The brutal crackdown by the regime's security forces have proven effective at maintaining their grip on power. But this time, it might not work, as there are reports that many ordinary police units and even some units of the Basij militia and the IRGC are not ready to carry out the kind of violence against the protesters that has been standard procedure in Iran for many years. This could be the breaking point for the Ayatollah regime, and even if it isn't, these are headaches and problems it can't really afford. Nevertheless, they're still saying they've got the advantage, and they're ready to try to hit Israel again. In fact, in an interview he gave to Iranian media and published last Saturday evening, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, who it's worth mentioning has been more pragmatic and intelligent than most of his predecessors in that job, said the following, quote, "In my opinion, we are at total war with the United States, Israel, and Europe. They want to bring our country to its knees," unquote. Later in the interview, he declared that, quote, "Our beloved military forces are doing their jobs with strength, and now, in terms of equipment and manpower, despite all the problems we have, they are stronger than when they were attacked. So if they want to attack, they will naturally face a more decisive response," unquote. Once again, I must say that these are not the words of someone who learned any lessons from the last war, and indeed the regime is currently engaged in an effort to rebuild its arsenal of ballistic missiles. This week, reports even emerged that the IRGC is trying to fit unconventional warheads on some of these missiles, possibly meant to carry chemical and biological weapons. This is bad news, of course, but it's also a sign that this regime must be getting very desperate. And I would say they're also getting even more irrational than ever before. Even the regime's allies, the Russians and the Chinese, would not be pleased to see Iran even threatening to use these kinds of unconventional weapons. The regime doesn't have a lot of friends in this world, and they're willing to risk losing the few friends they still have by engaging in this behavior. I think it's also relevant to remember what the late founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, once said, that, quote, Israel must be wiped off the map, unquote, and he was ready to watch half of Iran burn in order to achieve that objective. Well, right now, almost half of Iran's population lives in abject poverty, and even those with more affluence don't have access to many of the things that money would ordinarily buy. Tehran, the capital of Iran, is running out of water and has the worst air quality of any city in the entire world. Several other Iranian cities are in almost as bad shape, and Iran is rumored to have millions of people addicted to drugs. In other words, the Islamic Republic has been a catastrophic failure, and the only thing it ever managed to produce is misery, despair, and ballistic missiles. Oh, it has also produced Hezbollah. And on that subject, a report emerged in the Lebanese media last week saying that Hezbollah was demanding that Iran send them $2 billion to repair all the damage done to their military and civilian infrastructure in the last winter's war with Israel. But for the first time I personally can remember, Iran refused to send that much money, only sending $1 billion, which is still a lot in my opinion, and they're known to also be sending Hezbollah lots of weapons and ammunition as well. Some of it is being smuggled through the practically ungoverned spaces of eastern and southern Syria. Large shipments of weapons sent by Iran towards Hezbollah have been intercepted by forces loyal to the al-Jolani regime in Syria, as well as the Jordanian military, and even the Lebanese National Army has, surprisingly, stopped some of these shipments. But the IRGC is throwing a lot of material at the problem, and a fair amount is getting through. This is costing a lot of money, and that's one of the things the protesters in Tehran are angry about, and rightfully so. Getting back to Hezbollah, the IDF estimates that it has now replenished almost 40% of the ammunition it lost in the war last year. It's important to point out that they're not having as much success replacing the fighters they lost. Losing Hassan Nasrallah to an Israeli airstrike last November was a major blow to them in all these areas, and there's no replacing him. With all due respect, Naim Qassem, the man who did step into the role Nasrallah filled for over 30 years as Hezbollah's Secretary General, is not even close to being in the same league. Nevertheless, there's no question that Hezbollah is still very dangerous, and it is actively preparing for another attack on Israel, which I am sure will be futile but still could be very painful for us. At the same time, there are growing threats coming from other vectors. The Houthis, are they still around in Yemen? Certainly have not given up their enmity towards Israel, and they seem to have an idea to send thousands of their fighters north through the Hejaz region of western Saudi Arabia into Jordan and on into Israel. I'm not sure they have the capacity to actually do this, but just the fact that they're seriously contemplating it is alarming. I'm sure the Saudi and Jordanian military would do everything they can to stop these guys, but I'm not at all sure they'd be successful. However, a more realistic and equally alarming threat is that the Shiite militias Iran is arming and training in Iraq could attempt to march on Israel from the east, once again through Jordan. Jordan is aware of all these plans, by the way, and there is coordination with the Jordanian military, security, and intelligence services to stand firm against these kinds of threats. Jordan has no love for Israel, but they have even less for Iran and its proxies, and they also have a strong alliance with the Americans, which is meant to keep the region as stable as possible. That's why Jordan is participating in American strikes on ISIS in Syria this past week, which is a whole other big story, which is somewhat outside the scope of this report. But here in Israel, we're certainly watching this situation in Syria with interest, especially since the al-Jolani regime is cooperating with the American-led anti-ISIS campaign. That is certainly good news from our perspective. Israel is reluctantly coming to terms with al-Jolani, as he is deeply problematic with a much better option than any of the possible alternatives, including the Assad regime he pushed out of Syria. Now, there's one other Iranian-inspired threat to Israel that is taking form and could be a big problem for us in the new year of 2026 and possibly beyond, and that's the buildup of terrorist groups in Judea and Samaria. This is one of the 7 fronts that Israel has been fighting on for the last 2 years, and despite many successes that we've had, including the arrest or elimination of hundreds of known terrorist operatives, the threat is continuing and even escalating. This past week, a Palestinian man infiltrated into Israel from northern Samaria and went on a car ramming and stabbing rampage that left 2 Israelis dead and 2 others wounded. That included, unfortunately, an 18-year-old girl who was stabbed to death in front of her horrified father, who was unable to save her. As a father myself, I can only shake my head in horror at this report and pray nothing like that ever happens to my family or your families. But this is the nightmare scenario that every Israeli has been forced to contemplate ever since October 7, 2023. Our enemies have been severely beaten back on all fronts, but they're licking their wounds, rebuilding their capabilities, and getting ready for another round. I've said it before, and I'll say it again now, that their behavior might seem irrational to Western eyes, but they take their own theological and ideological rhetoric seriously. They're not interested in having a good quality of life in this mortal plane. They have their eyes on the next life, and according to their theological narrative, if they destroy Israel, they'll have a great eternity. Good luck, guys. But if Israel is allowed to continue existing, it calls their entire narrative into question, and that means they're probably not going to have such a great eternity. That's a crude and perhaps simplistic way to frame the issue, but that's pretty much the way it is. Now, there's one other thing that we need to talk about, and that's the inventory of Israel's Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 air defense interceptors. During the 12-day war, to say nothing of the months and months of almost daily ballistic missile attacks by the Houthis in Yemen, Israel used up a large percentage of its interceptors. During the 12-day war, the U.S. military is estimated to have intercepted about half of the Iranian missiles that were fired at us, and there's no guarantee that they can or will do the same thing next time. That is why in any future war, passive defense, also known as bomb shelters, are going to be even more important to protect Israeli lives than they were during the 12-day war in June. That is why here at Vision for Israel, we are continuing our campaign to place bomb safety shelters in communities all over the country. We're also continuing to provide equipment for emergency response teams, firefighters, and others who need our help. This war is not over by any means, and the next stage here in 2026 might even be more intense for Israel's home front than the last one was. So please watch this short video, go to our website at visionforisrael.com, and see how you can be part of this project to equip the home front. After October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war, and the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. Now I need to tell you about a diplomatic move that Israel took this week that set off a 5-alarm fire in the Middle East and even prompted an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. I'm talking about Israel's recognition of Somaliland, which on the map looks like a big chunk of a country called Somalia. But with all due respect to the map, Somaliland has been operating as a functionally independent state for over 30 years. Did you know that? While the rest of Somalia has been one of the most dysfunctional countries on the planet. Israel's recognition of Somaliland could lead to closer cooperation against the Houthis in Yemen, and for some reason, this is viewed very negatively by many Arab and Muslim countries in the Middle East. I guess theoretically they just don't like the precedent it sets. They probably also don't like the fact that Somalia, even if it is essentially a figment of the UN's imagination, is a Muslim state that many of them have friendly relations with, so they feel compelled to come to the defense of their friend. But the UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain, all members of the Abraham Accords, didn't protest this move by Israel one bit, which is a statement in and of itself. We'll have to see what happens with this relationship going forward, but I'm very optimistic. My optimism is also given a boost by the statements made by U.S. President Donald J. Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu following their meeting on Monday at the Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Now, if you haven't watched that press conference, I encourage you to do so. But to summarize, President Trump said that he's ready to move to Phase B in his ceasefire plan for the Gaza Strip, and that Hamas had better disarm or they'll be hell to pay. He also said that he's very aware of the threat from Iran and that he's ready to hear more about Israel's plans to carry out preemptive strikes on Iran's ballistic missile production facilities and other military infrastructure. Now, I personally take that to mean that it's likely that plans for a joint U.S.-Israel strike on Iran are already very far advanced and are practically ready to go, requiring only an order from the political echelon to be executed. I might be wrong, but that's how it looks to me. President Trump also said that Hezbollah is behaving very badly, and he's inclined to let Israel launch another operation against it to put an end to the threats it poses, since the Lebanese National Army doesn't seem to be up to the task. President Trump also spoke about the importance of reinforcing the regime of Syria's interim president, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and he also said that Turkish President Recep Erdogan is his friend and that Netanyahu respects him. This remark drew a sharp and probably unintended look from Netanyahu, which many commentators said was an indication that Bibi didn't like it or agree with it. Of course, he's not going to publicly disagree with President Trump, especially about something that's not really much of a hill to die on. But that wasn't the only disagreement the two leaders had. Reports from unnamed sources said that behind closed doors, there was also sharp disagreements between American and Israeli officials over issues related to Judea and Samaria. Folks, Judea and Samaria is not the West Bank, even though the news calls it that. It is the heartland, the breadbasket, the part of biblical Israel that we all want to see part of Israel. This probably shouldn't surprise anyone, as earlier this month, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited President Trump and told him very candidly that he would need an Israeli commitment for a path to some kind of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria before he could proceed with joining the Abraham Accords. President Trump has made getting Saudi Arabia to join the Accords a major foreign policy goal of his second term, so he's trying to find a way to make it happen. Please join me in praying for this important issue, as the Bible makes it very clear how the story ends for the nations that try to divide up the promised land. If Crown Prince bin Salman is watching this, my advice is to tell your people the truth and stop being afraid of how they'll react. If you keep concealing the truth from them, they'll never allow you to make the good decisions that you need to make. And that advice goes for the governments of every other country in this world too, including the Israeli political echelon and the Israeli government. Now, there's another big story that's making headlines in Israel this week as we've passed from 2025 now into 2026, and that's the very unusual patterns we're seeing regarding the subject of Aliyah, or going up, or the immigration of Jewish people to Israel. For the last several years, most of the Jewish people who made Aliyah to Israel came from Russia, and in the last 3 years, those numbers have risen dramatically, along with larger than usual numbers from the Ukraine. There's no mystery about why this is happening, as these two countries are engaged in the largest war in Europe since World War II, which has led to a sharp drop in the quality of life for ordinary people in both countries. That's a story that deserves a special report all its own, but we don't have time for that right now. Suffice it to say that since early 2022, a very large cohort of Jewish people have made Aliyah to Israel from these Russian-speaking countries. But in 2025, those numbers dropped dramatically. It's probably because most of the Jewish people who were living in those two countries before the war started have left by now, with most of them coming to Israel already. However, the drop in Aliyah from Russia and Ukraine in 2025 has been accompanied by a sharp rise in Aliyah from Western countries, finally, especially France, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. And as I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear, antisemitism is the motivator driving this rise in Western Aliyah. It's not just online bullying and harassment on the streets, as unpleasant as that sort of thing is. It is also violent attacks against Jewish individuals and symbols, including synagogues and community centers from Manchester, England to Sydney, Australia, being marred, destroyed, ruined, whatever it is. It's anti-Semitism, a disease. Last month, the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption actually held drills to try and prepare for the possibility of a large sudden influx of new immigrants, which is something that hasn't happened in a very short time frame since the early 1990s. Skills that aren't practiced on are lost, and the ministry is wise enough to know they're a little rusty, so they're trying to shape up, or they better ship out. The process of Aliyah can take up to 18 months from the time that a potential new immigrant opens a file with the ministry, and there are nearly 100,000 people all over the world, primarily in Western countries, who are in that pipeline. Now, it's also notable that about 1/3 of the new immigrants that came in 2025 and a large number of those who are in the process of coming in 2026 are between the ages of 18 to 35. That's important because the younger a person is when they make Aliyah, like when I made Aliyah, the easier it will be for them to integrate into the culture and society, and that will increase the chances that they will stay here long term and contribute to Israel's growth and development. And maybe they're not married, so they could find a wife here too, or a husband. Now that's especially true for immigrants from Western countries for a few different reasons which would take a long time to explain. The short version is that Israel is very different from most Western countries in all kinds of ways, and the numbers of Western origin Israelis are relatively small compared to the numbers from Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Now, because of that, when they arrive here, Jews from Western countries often find that they are a cultural minority, and that's a hard pill for anyone to swallow, especially if there's not much help available. This is just one of the many projects that Vision for Israel has embarked on to help new immigrants take their first steps into their new lives here in Israel. We also have many social welfare and assistance programs for new immigrants, veteran residents, tourists, and anyone else who needs help navigating life in this country. So please watch this next short video about these projects, and don't forget to go to our website, visionforisrael.com. Welcome back, friends. We're almost out of time. I don't have a watch anyways for this week's report, so I'll just very briefly go through some of the other big stories, and then I want to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. Some news that's good and also bad is that this past week saw a massive winter storm hit the eastern Mediterranean, dumping massive amounts of rain on Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Jordan. That caused flooding in many areas, but that's a problem that people in arid climates can live with, as it is vastly better than having a drought. Nonetheless, a fair amount of property damage occurred in Israel, and I also have to mention that in the Gaza Strip there were several weather-related fatalities, and thousands of tents and other temporary structures that had been put up to try and give some shelter to the population were destroyed in the storm. So please continue to pray for the ordinary people of Gaza who have suffered a lot over the past 2 years and continue to suffer a lot because of the evil tyranny of Hamas that they have no choice but to endure. I know the polls say that there's a lot of support for Hamas among this population, and there is also broad support for terrorism against Israel and much else. So I would invite you to pray for them to also have a change of heart while you're praying for them to find some relief from their suffering. Now the good news I want to end this report on is that there is a large increase in construction in Israel that will have many benefits for the people who live here, both Jews and Arabs. This includes new power plants, hospitals, commercial spaces, schools, and residential buildings. It's not easy living in this massive construction zone called Jerusalem, but we look forward to a wonderful future when it's all finished, whenever that will be. With that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of the VFI News from Israel. Once again, Happy New Year to all of you.